Today, I'm absolutely delighted that we can now welcome Dame Heather Rabbatts to join me, and we're going to explore what I think this week's biggest news story is, and that's the postponement of the Tokyo 2020 Freudian Olympic Games to next year. Now, for those of you that know me from my professional background, I'm no Olympic scholar. I know my way around the business, finance, and economics of the sports sector. Heather, though, is an outstanding mind. She is chair of Vero Communications. For those of you that don't know who Vero are, they're the strategic communications consultancy that helped secure the 2024 Games in Paris. She's the first female board member of the Football Association, and she's the founder of the Women's Sport Group. And we're also really lucky that she's an advisory board member with us at InSport. So let's try this properly. Hello, Heather. How are you doing?
Hello, I'm fine. I'm sorry that you can't see me, but we're sort of battling with technology in this slightly weird world that we all find ourselves in. But I'm sure in a week's time, it will all be mastered.
Let's hope so.
We hope so.
Yeah. So Heather, what we're going to talk about today over the next 20 minutes or so is the postponement of the Tokyo Olympics.
Yeah.
I was doing some number crunching because my first research master's degree was on the economics of sport events, and I remember back to, or rather, when I was reading through literature, should I say, the Montreal Olympic Games in 1976, and it's fairly well publicised that particular Olympic Games lost something in the region of $700 million. Now, in today's money, that's around about $3.2 billion. So it's a significant loss in terms of the organisation of the Games. I guess from your experience, what do you think will be the real concerns at the moment for the Tokyo organising committee, and I guess the Japanese economy as well, and how they're going to navigate through these next 12 months?
Thank you very much. And you know, we are living in unprecedented times, and there's no route map that anybody has in this particular crisis that we are all globally facing. But in terms of sort of some initial thoughts on this, I mean, the Japanese financial newspaper today has said that they think the additional costs are going to be something like 2.7 billion due to the postponement. The Games had an initial budget of 12.6 billion, although the audit agency have actually said they're already at 28 billion. So the costs have already spiraled, and now we're looking at additional costs. And of course, the IOC now has to talk with all of the federations around these new dates for both the Olympics and Paralympics. And part of the difficulty in rescheduling is that you've got world champions events for various other sports. We've seen the delay of the Euros in terms of football. So you've got a really crowded calendar, as well as, of course, now having to renegotiate on the media side, on media rights and on sponsorship. So you have a series of colliding issues that now have to be discussed in very short order to try and achieve an Olympics by next year. And they've made it clear that they view it as absolutely a priority to have the Olympics next year and for it not to be postponed any further. There's also, of course, the fact that while some athletes will have already qualified, many haven't. So there's still qualifying rounds that need to be undertaken, which certainly cannot be undertaken now. So you have a series of huge colliding issues, which now the IOC has to begin to urgently address, and not least in terms of the funding with the and financing of the Olympics with in Japan.
Yeah, so we talked last week on the first InSport webinar about the impact of or the difference rather between postponing and cancelling lower league football, and the dependency that lower league football clubs has on its match day income and that type of thing. And there was a very clear statement this week, I think, in the announcement of the postponing of the games that it wasn't being cancelled. And I was doing a bit of research. I think the only time that the Modern Olympics has been cancelled in its 124-year history was in 1944, and of course that was
Yeah.
because the world decided to shut itself down and do some really crazy stuff. So the fact that they've postponed this games is really important, isn't it? Because, like you say, there the athletes, and we'll perhaps come on to the athletes and what they need to do shortly, but the impact on the sponsors, excuse me, the commercial partners, those TV rights holders is going to be so profound. The sponsors have paid more for the sponsorship rights of the Tokyo 2020 games than we've ever seen before in the Olympic movement, and of course the broadcasters will have invested very heavily. So that whole rescheduling that you talk about is going to be quite important to navigate as well, isn't it?
No, that's going to be crucial, and of course, if you're a sponsor and indeed you're a broadcaster, you also now have other major sporting events, as I've said, the Euros, which are all now, both men and women's, potentially happening in the same year. So how you navigate your way through that calendar in terms of ensuring that you can still maximize your financial position is going to be very critical. And as I said, we're sort of in uncharted territory here, where you've had such a large scale, it's huge, as we all know, the Olympics, subject to this type of postponement, and all of the interdependencies that will now to be very quickly worked through, because actually it's a very short amount of time to reschedule and rearrange this event.
Yeah, that colliding is going to be quite interesting, isn't it? Particularly for any potential new sponsors, because this might also show some opportunities. And in the face of these kind of adverse conditions, there are always organisations that will try and do something differently. And we've seen right across the world, actually, in response to the coronavirus pandemic, lots and lots of people coming together and thinking about new ways of working with each other. This is one such example. And so do you think that even though there's going to be this, I think it was well publicised, 2 billion hole in the budget, or at least additional costs that Tokyo are going to have to spend over the next 12 months to get the games on at a later point, do you think there's also an opportunity here to generate additional monies through sponsorship, through commercial activities, and even through the likes of new media? Because just this platform that we're working on today demonstrates that, once we get around some of the technical issues, they can be quite secure platforms, and they can be used to harness quite a lot of collaboration.
I think that's all correct. What I also believe is that at the moment, none of us know quite what the aftershock effects of this pandemic are going to be. I was talking to an academic recently. He was describing this as the fourth industrial revolution, that when we emerge from this, actually there will be fundamental changes in terms of whether remote working will become actually much more the norm than it has been hitherto, because people and companies will realize that they can cooperate on this basis and look to change that way of working. Retail is going to be fundamentally I think impacted by what's going on, and you can see it across every sector. Now, out of this crisis, absolutely, I think there will be new opportunities. There will be companies who will emerge as, if you like, both new entrants or companies that were already gaining ground, whether we're talking in terms of their broadcast platforms or in esports, who are now, of course, becoming the ways in which athletes can train, because you can't train you can only train in terms of your own space and virtually, and making use of that software. So we will absolutely see a whole range of shifts in terms of what it means around the preparation, what it means about who's going to enter the market or leave the market in terms of broadcasters, the role of social media, and indeed what sponsors will look for in the course of 2021. So I think it's probably, we're so in the virus at the moment, it's quite difficult to think about or be predictive around what those opportunities might look like. But I think we'll start to see some more thought being given to those as these next months unfold.
Okay, so it's probably going to have a look at some of those business propositions over the coming months, like you say. Now, your work at Vero on the securing of the 2024 games, what were the key things you were always looking for as part of the strategy to help support that games bid? And you just pretend you were in this Tokyo 2020 situation. What are the types of things that you'd be looking for, as part of a communication strategy to try and limit the impact that that this postponement is going to have?
So one of the really hugely important narrative messages on any Olympic campaign is to be able to articulate what it means actually for the country and for a region to host the Olympics. So what it says about your place and the sustainability of that impact in terms of regeneration beyond the Olympics is hugely important. And I think that question of having ensuring that the level of investment matches a future sustainability, whether that's in terms of what it means to your own sport and cultural strategy in a country, whether that means around how you are building the stadia. All of those issues actually are very important to your brand narrative. And for Tokyo, that will taking some of those messages and going back to them and finding ways of retelling that story as the virus, we all hope, is contained. It will be an important reminder as to why they wanted to host the Olympics. I mean, it's very historic for Tokyo to host the Olympics. It was a massive statement for the country and for the region. It's one of the reasons why they were successful. And I think actually looking back to those messages about what they see as the great strengths of their country will be a really important part of instilling confidence going forward, because I think confidence after the seismic shock that everybody is experiencing will be as true for the Olympics as it will be for any other sector of the economy, and that we can come back together as a community in terms of sport and celebrate sporting achievement. And I think the values of the Olympics and the original values of the Olympics, again, we all hope will emerge stronger as a community. We try and support each other through this virus. And I think we are seeing some of that voice emerging across, here in the UK, the number of people who are volunteering to help. All of that speaks to that there is something that we all hang on to in terms of our humanity. And whilst the technology and how we all are virtually operating can get us through this time, what we all want to find a way back to is that human connection. And that's where sport is fundamental. And that's why I think once we can go back to our football games or our athletic meetings or whatever sport we may love and be involved in, I think you'll see a massive resurgence of interest and engagement. Now, for the Olympics, that could be a really important opportunity. We know that some of the Olympic sports have been struggling. And so I think if, you're sitting there as a federation currently within the IOC, trying to ensure that there is this real sense of how holding the Olympics can be that sort of inspirational moment to the world around how we come together as people who have all been through, and we are all experiencing this pandemic. And I think that is one of the great hopes for the Olympics for next year. Yeah,
I think you finished saying what you were saying, and I was wondering if I'd lost you then. Sorry, Heather, it's my fault completely.
That's all right.
I was just thinking then, as you were talking through those social side of things and the inspirational legacies and the importance of sport and society, and we've had a couple of questions on the chat. I was just glancing over that, are bringing through this idea of this kind of social connection in many ways. And as an academic, we tend to focus on, I guess, 5 core strands of impact from for major events. The economics always takes over and it grabs the headlines. And we know that Tokyo's spending in the order of something like 10 billion. It's going to rise. We know that Sochi and the Winter Olympics that were over there was about 18 billion. And we know increasingly that through the 80s, certainly in the 90s and early 2000s, that organising committees are working very hard to make sure that economic legacy was left behind. And in more recent games, we've seen perhaps a plateauing of that, and that's happened because a number of organisers have gone after things like urban regeneration strategies, and we know there's been a huge amount of infrastructure work, for example, in Tokyo and in Japan more broadly. We know that major events are coming together in core areas, so that you can use facilities more multi-use. Of course, the Rugby World Cup was over in that part of the world last year. We know that sport tourism benefits are there, and there's a lot of emerging research around the importance of tourism. When I was reading through some of the data on the Rio Olympics, they saw a spike in around about 6% of additional tourism benefit to the country after the games have finished. So sport tourism is there, which we'll have to think about. But one of the big ones, and actually under-researched ones, is that celebration, social, cultural benefit of an Olympic movement or of a sporting contest itself. And you talked quite nicely there about how important this might be for the future of the Olympic movement. And Dan Parnell's dropped a question into the text around there's been a huge amount of criticism from the public and a number of academic quarters. Return on investments for Olympic Games simply aren't there and are simply not sustainable. So because of that, and because of all the kind of other public health issues, do you think that the Olympic Games is in a position to try and capitalise on this pandemic and help us celebrate the end of it, so providing we get there, and bring nations back together through sport as a sporting movement? Or do you think this might be a real challenge for the integrity of sporting events, in the next 10 or 15 years?
Well, that's a very big question.
Sorry. I'm probably not one for the next 2 or 3 minutes, but
yeah, I think so. First of all, I think the Olympic movement, even prior to the pandemic, is facing a major challenge. We've seen a decline in the number of countries who are prepared to bid to host Olympics because of the huge costs, and where there have been referenda held in countries, they often lead to a no vote, that we don't want to bid. So there is something fundamental that the IOC do need to attend to, where the costs of mounting the Olympics have risen so astronomically. So that issue remains. What I think for the IOC now is there an opportunity to reinvigorate and reinvent their original values around how sport, bringing nations together, can be inspirational and actually can make a difference. I think that social messaging is probably it has become as important in some ways as the messaging which will be about how you deliver on value for money, which has always been a very tricky issue for the Olympics, because it all depends on your view on the sustainability of the regeneration that's taking part. So actually 2012, in terms of what happened for London in that quarter of London, is showing signs that the regeneration plans have been pretty effective. That has been less of the case in Brazil, for example, where a number of those sites are sadly falling fallow. So I think there's a fundamental rethink that the IOC were needing to reflect on because of the spiraling cost of hosting the Olympics. And now there's an opportunity to think about how do we re-emphasize the original values as to why the Olympics was born in the first place and what it stood for.
I think that's a really interesting point you made there about the bidding for these events. We used to see a huge amount of interest, didn't we, in because countries thought there was this real tangible economic benefit, and it was only when the cost started to unravel that that we started to look at that economic impact in a little bit more detail. And I guess it was post 2005 with that Singapore bid that London ultimately won, that has kind of slowed down that bidding process, hasn't it? So we often see now a number of countries might think to themselves, well, we'll express an interest in hosting this, see who else is also in the mix for it, and actually then back off. So the bid activity is becoming a much cheaper exercise compared to what it used to be, because when you had countries competing against each other and trying to make their bid documents look so much better, and vast array of urban regeneration projects made it very, very costly exercise. And so I think you make a really fascinating point there around the reduction in bidding. And again, we've had a couple of questions on the in the Q&A box about whether we think there's going to be delays for bidding processes for other major events, and I think that's probably inevitable. And we'll start to see now almost like a resetting of the system, so to speak, for some of these major games. Extending way beyond the Olympics, Paralympics, and the football competitions as well. Would you agree with that broadly?
Well, yes. So I think just going back to the Olympic bidding point, which a number of us have flagged previously. So the issue isn't the cost of bidding. The issue is the cost of hosting, and hosting has become prohibitive, and that's why countries and communities have been voting against it. I think that means for the IOC, they need to look at some of their requirements that they insist upon in order to host the Olympics. That's a whole other conversation that needs to be had, and was required even before this pandemic. So I think that's one basket of challenges. I think the other is, of course, the interdependencies on the global sporting calendar about the postponement of these Olympics. We've already seen the Euros move. There are the Women's World Cup bids that are currently underway. There have obviously delays in all of those processes because you can't get congresses together. You're having to do them virtually. So we are now looking at a whole, slew of major sporting tournaments that could potentially be time shifted. Now, at the same time, if you're FIFA or if you're UEFA, you're also trying to attend to the momentum of your own sport, as well as securing your revenues going forward. So the tension between thinking about how far you will postpone your own event because of another competing event will be a live debate and discussion. And there is a limit to how far you can push out these events because you've already, of course, got agreements in place. So I think we're going to see, there's obviously going to be a great deal of discussion over these forthcoming months because other bidding processes are due to start from September of this year.
Yeah, I think it'd be interesting as well the way the athletes themselves have to now kind of reposition their cycles, because I was never a world-class swimmer, but as somebody that would train regularly for particular events, you would go through your kind of training pattern and make sure you try to qualify for those games. And very often these athletes are going to be on a 4-year cycle. They're at least in the UK, their UK sport funding is going to be linked to that Olympic cycle. So I think some of the fallout now that we're going to start to hear about is not just these big grand hosting costs. A couple of chat questions are talking about the differences in what we'll see with commercial deals and sponsorships, and there's probably a necessity for those sponsors, in much the same way as the athletes, is now to extend their exposure period, if you like, over the next 12 months to prepare themselves for the main event. But it's going to put a lot of pressure now, isn't it, on those athletes as well, and on the funded position of many of them in the UK and of course across the world as well.
Absolutely. So there is talk about whether they bring the Olympics slightly forward in terms of whether you could bring it closer to springtime than summertime. that, of course, absolutely has a major impact on the training regime of the athletes. I think there's something like half of the 11,000 scheduled athlete participants have qualified, but the sports such as boxing have still the majority of their qualifying tournaments interrupted. So I think probably bringing it slightly earlier will prove very difficult for all of the athletes. Of course, they've been through a major period of uncertainty. They're also, as I've said now, of course, training in inglorious isolation. And actually, for many, the training regimes, of course, are hugely difficult. There is only so much that you can be doing in the virtual space. So just getting the athletes, in the best possible shape to participate next year will have particular challenges, and all of those federations will now be trying to reflect on what is in the best interest of their sport and their competitors.
Okay. So we've got, what we're going to try and do is keep to our kind of half-hour broadcast, because we know that people have tried to schedule their remote working lives around this. What I've been trying to do throughout this last certainly the last 15 minutes or so of the discussion is just weave in some of the questions that have been coming through on the Q&A box, so that everyone has got a question answered. We've picked up quite a lot there on the commercials, on the sponsorship, on the periodization of the athletes. We've got a couple of questions in here about what happens to people that were planning to move into things like the Olympic Village, and I think the straightforward answer to that is that they're going to be displaced now until that competition is able to take place, unless of course they can come to an agreement whereby they can move in and then have a bit of a holiday, let's say, when the Olympics is back on. A number of questions we've been having through around repositioning other championships. So there was a couple of questions on the Euro Championships that you talked about earlier. There's also things like the Copa America, and we're going to get now a really compressed sporting calendar, I think, aren't we, over the next 18 months, where sports are going to be competing a bit with each other for TV viewing, for additional sponsorships, for crowd attendances, and so on. And what we will hopefully see from an economics point of view, at least from my point of view, is whilst there might be this slight depression now with people not spending because they're not able to, we'll probably see quite a surge over the next 12 months of all that money recirculating through economies. So, so Heather, I don't know if you've got any final comments you want to put forward to everybody before we close down.
I think the only comment I would try and make, both around the Olympics but more broadly around sport, is that I really believe that when we come through this terrible crisis that we're all experiencing, and because it's a crisis that is forcing us into isolation, that the world of sport will be one of the opportunities for us to come together again. And I think there will be, as I said, whether you're talking about your kids back in little leagues playing football or baseball, whatever it might mean, I think there will be a resurgence of interest across sport. And I think that is something that we should hold on to in these dark and challenging times.
Heather, it's been brilliant. I'm really pleased that we managed to get at least half of the tech sorted, so you could join us on the InSport weekly seminar. We've jumped around a little bit. I think we've covered a fairly broad range of information. These are never intended, as the audience knows, to really kind of give a huge deep dive into some of these issues. It's supposed to be just a general chat around stuff. And your insights have been brilliant for me. That last message, I think, is really kind of uplifting, and hopefully leaves all of our listeners and viewers with a nice feeling on this sunny Friday in Sheffield. At least I don't know what it's like by you.
Sunny here too.
Good stuff. Okay. So Heather, thanks very much. Everybody else, thanks for tuning in, and we will see you hopefully next week. All right.
Take
care,
very
everybody.
Much. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.